on the cold concrete bench outside Vanderbilt Hospital. I sat with my hands clenched so tightly in my lap they had gone numb. The spring sunlight spilled across the pavement, warm and golden. But inside me, there was nothing, only static. The dull hum of grief that had taken over everything. Ellis was still alive. Barely. For 3 days he had drifted in and out of consciousness. His voice thin, his skin nearly translucent. Each time I looked at him, I wondered if it would be the last. I had told him I was stepping out for air, but the truth was simpler and uglier. I couldn't let him see me break. I wasn't sure I could pull myself back together if I did. I was a nurse. I had sat beside death more times than I could count, held strangers' hands as they passed, stayed long after my shift ended so no one would die alone. But none of that prepared me for this, for watching my only son fade, powerless to save him. Ellis was just 20 years old, still so young, yet braver than anyone I had ever met. That morning, even as his body failed him, he had tried to smile. He told me not to cry, said he wasn't afraid, just tired. I kissed his forehead and promised I would be right back. And now, here I was, staring at the glass doors of the hospital, watching strangers carry coffee cups and laugh into their phones like the world hadn't collapsed. I rubbed my thumb across the gold wedding band on my finger, the one I had never taken off even after Jonas. Ellis's father died of a heart attack when Ellis was 3. I had raised Ellis alone, worked endless night shifts, scraped through years of exhaustion just to keep him warm and fed. I remembered the days I came home still in my scrubs, collapsing on the couch, waking to find him curled up beside me, drawing on the edge of my sleeve with a marker. He had grown into someone gentle, resilient, the kind of young man who stayed late to help others with their projects and carried himself like an old soul. And now his bone marrow was failing, and nothing, not the registries, not the lists we scoured, not the prayers I whispered in hallways had given us an answer. That was when I heard them. 2 nurses just around the corner, chatting casually. At first, their words blurred like background noise. But then one of them said something that froze me where I sat. "You know that kid in ICU? He looks just like someone I saw last week in Ridgetop Springs." The other laughed softly, brushing it off. But then she added, "Same eyes, same jawline. They could have been brothers." That word struck me like a stone to the chest. Brothers. There was no reason to believe it. Ellis was adopted. No known siblings, no family history to trace. Yet the moment I heard it, something in me clicked, a gravity I couldn't shake. By dawn the next morning, I was on the road. I told the nurses I needed space to clear my head. But in truth, I was chasing that single fragile thread. Ridgetop Springs lay 2 hours east, its fields wrapped in fog and dew. I gripped the wheel as though it might steady the storm inside me. When I arrived, I stopped at a small hardware store and showed Ellis's photo to the man behind the counter. He studied it, then nodded slowly. "You're not the first to say that. That's Luke Caro. Lives near the ridge, past the corn silos." The name meant nothing to me, but I wrote it down with trembling hands. The house sat on a hill, paint peeling, an old pickup in the yard. I nearly turned back, but then the door opened and he stepped out. A young man in his early 20s, tall, lean, with blonde hair falling across his forehead. And when he looked at me, my heart lurched. The shape of his jaw. His eyes, they weren't just similar to Ellis's. They mirrored them. I forced myself to steady my voice. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone named Luke." He nodded. "That's me." Inside, the house smelled of pine and coffee. He poured tea without asking and sat across from me, cautious but open. After a long silence, he told me something that made the ground tilt beneath me. His father, Walter, had raised him as his own. But months earlier, on his deathbed, Walter confessed Luke was not his biological child. He had been handed over by a desperate man who already had another baby, a man whose wife never knew. That baby, the one kept in the shadows, had been me. My chest tightened. The delivery room 20 years ago came flooding back. I remembered being told I had carried twins, but only one survived. I mourned the child I thought I had lost. But now, sitting across from Luke, I realized the truth. Both had lived. One had been taken. I showed him Ellis's photo. His face softened instantly, eyes narrowing as though he was looking into a mirror he had never known existed. "That's him?" he asked. I nodded. "Ellis. He's in ICU back in Nashville. His marrow is failing. Without a transplant, he won't last much longer." Luke's jaw clenched, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. Then he said the words I will never forget. "He's my brother." He didn't hesitate, not for a second. "I'll do it." The drive back to Nashville blurred into a string of headlights and dark stretches of road. Luke followed close behind, his truck steady in my rearview mirror. I kept checking it, not from fear, but from a fragile sense of relief, like proof that I wasn't carrying this burden alone anymore. For weeks, I had walked hospital corridors with nothing but exhaustion and unanswered prayers. Now, for the first time, there was someone beside me who shared Ellis's blood. I didn't know if this would work. Didn't know if hope was wise or foolish, but it was enough to keep me moving. We reached the hospital just past midnight. The halls were silent, except for the hum of machines and the occasional squeak of rubber soles on polished floors. I signed Luke in, handed the nurse Ellis's information, and led him toward the room I had memorized down to the pattern of the tiles. Ellis was awake, propped weakly against his pillows, pale but alert. His eyes lifted as soon as I stepped inside, then shifted past me. When he saw Luke, something raw and immediate passed across his face. Confusion first, then wonder, then the kind of recognition that needs no words. Luke froze by the door, unsure whether to smile or speak. Ellis blinked, his voice hoarse but steady. Is that Luke?" stepped forward, his words barely above a whisper. "I think we're brothers." Ellis's eyes filled before I could answer. Tears broke loose, not from pain, but from something deeper. It was instinct, the sudden click of a mirror finding its match. Luke moved closer, reached for Ellis's hand, and they held on as if they had always known. I stood by the door, covering my mouth, finally letting myself cry after days of numbness. When the nurse came to check vitals, she paused, startled by their resemblance, but said nothing. After she left, Ellis turned to me. "Is he really?" I nodded. "Same father, same blood." Ellis squeezed Luke's hand tighter, and Luke didn't pull away. I laid my own hand over theirs, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something solid beneath me again. The doctors moved quickly once testing began. Blood was drawn. Samples rushed to the lab. Waiting for the results stretched time like an elastic band, every second taut with possibility. When the hematologist finally stepped into the room, I braced myself for disappointment. Instead, she smiled and said Luke wasn't just a match, he was ideal. The kind of rare compatibility they rarely saw. I nearly collapsed in the hallway, my legs giving way under the weight of sudden hope. Preparation began immediately. Luke signed consent forms without hesitation. He didn't ask for details or delays, just nodded as though the decision had been waiting inside him all his life. Ellis, frail but alert, whispered a trembling, "Thank you." Luke only shrugged, holding his brother's gaze. It's what brothers do. On the morning of the procedure, I sat between two rooms, one son giving, the other receiving. Nurses moved briskly around me, IV bags dangling from their arms, charts clipped to their chests. The process looked so ordinary, so clinical, like it could have been any day, any body. But it wasn't. It was my son's, one I had raised alone, one I never knew existed, bound together by a chance at survival. As the hours passed, I replayed the missing years in my mind. Ellis, asleep beside me on the couch while I still wore my work shoes. Luke, somewhere else, growing up under another roof, carving furniture with his hands, wondering why he didn't look like anyone around him. Both of them mine, and yet half their lives stolen by secrets I never chose. I could have raged, could have drowned in the bitterness of what was kept from me. But sitting there, waiting for news, all I felt was awe. Awe that even what was broken could be pieced back together. Not perfectly, but enough to hold. The nurses finally emerged, their expressions calm but reassuring. Both boys were stable. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I doubled over in the chair, covering my face with trembling hands. When I entered Ellis's room, his skin was warm again, color returning faintly to his cheeks. He reached for me, and I pressed my lips to his forehead, breathing in the steady rhythm of his lungs. Luke came in later, pale from the donation, but smiling faintly. He sat at the foot of Ellis's bed, and without a word, Ellis reached out to clasp his wrist. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was thick with recognition, with something truer than explanation. I leaned back in the chair, my body heavy with exhaustion, but lighter than it had been in weeks. I had thought I was losing my only son. Instead, I had found two. Weeks passed, and slowly the world began to shift back into color. Ellis's strength returned in small bursts, at first an appetite one day, a half smile the next, until suddenly it was all at once. His cheeks filled again, his voice grew steadier, and his laughter began to echo down the hospital corridor the way it had once filled our small kitchen at home. The nurses who had watched his decline now stopped by just to see him upright, walking the halls with cautious determination. Hope, which had once felt dishonest, became tangible again, rooted in each step he managed to take without faltering. Luke stayed close through it all. He never made a fuss about what he had given, never asked for gratitude. When Ellis tried to thank him again, voice-catching, Luke only waved it off. "It's what brothers do," he said, as if it had always been that way. He visited daily, sometimes lingering late into the evening, sitting with Ellis as they swapped stories of childhoods that had grown in different soils but seemed to share the same roots. I watched them, their faces bent toward each other in quiet conversation, and realized how much time had been stolen from them. Yet here they were, building something new out of the pieces. When Ellis was discharged, I expected Luke to drift back to his life in Ridgetop Springs, but he didn't. Instead, he began appearing at our door each evening, toolbox in hand, ready to fix the things I had let fall into disrepair during the long years of worry. The flickering porch light, the stubborn back gate. He worked in silence mostly, but it was the kind of silence that steadied a house. After dinner, he would sit on the porch with us, tea in his hand, listening as Ellis told him about books he loved, or the music that had carried him through sleepless nights. The way Luke listened, really listened, was enough to convince me he belonged. Not as a guest, but as someone who had always been missing. One evening, after Ellis had gone inside to rest, Luke and I remained on the porch. The summer air was thick with fireflies, their glow blinking softly across the yard. I turned to him, the words pressing at my chest. "Do you forgive me?" I asked. He didn't look surprised, as though he had been waiting for me to say it. "I never blamed you," he said gently. "You didn't know?" "I didn't know?" "None of us did." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I wish I had more to give you than this porch and these quiet nights." He smiled, soft and certain. "You gave me a name?" Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I let them fall. It wasn't regret that weighed on me anymore, it was relief. The kind that comes from knowing the worst storm has passed and left something standing in its place. Inside. Ellis's laugh carried faintly through the screen door, bright and unguarded, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had one son and a missing piece. I felt like I had two sons, both whole, both here. The days settled into a rhythm, ordinary yet extraordinary in their simplicity. Ellis grew stronger with every passing week, until he was walking without help, teasing me about the way I fussed over his meals, asking Luke about projects he could help with around the house. Luke, for his part, never spoke of what he had given, but his presence alone was its own gift. He filled the spaces Jonas once had the quiet fixing of broken things, the easy steadiness at the dinner table but without the guardedness, without the weight of secrets. Some nights I would step onto the porch after the dishes were done and see them both there. One sprawled on the steps, the other leaning back in the chair, talking in low voices that rose and fell with laughter. It struck me then how easily they had slipped into each other's lives, as if they had always been brothers, as if the years lost were simply pages left blank in a book they were now writing together. I knew I couldn't change what had been taken from us, the truth stolen at birth. The years spent apart, but I could hold on to what we had now, and what we had was more than survival. It was family, mended not perfectly, but honestly, stitched together by choice as much as blood. By late summer, the house no longer felt like a place haunted by machines and waiting rooms. It felt alive again. Ellis's color returned almost overnight, and his appetite soon followed. He was back to joking with the neighbors, scribbling notes for stories he wanted to write, even teasing me about how much I hovered. Every time I saw him walking across the yard with sunlight on his face, it felt like witnessing a small miracle. Luke became part of that rhythm as naturally as if he had always been there. He worked odd jobs in town during the day and spent most evenings with us. Sometimes he fixed whatever needed fixing, the warped door frame, the rickety steps, and other times he simply sat with Ellis, listening to his stories, nodding with a quiet attentiveness that seemed to heal something words couldn't. Watching them together, side by side, I often caught myself wondering how no one had seen it sooner. How two faces so clearly carved from the same stone could have lived apart for so long. There were nights when, after Ellis went to bed, Luke and I would sit outside on the porch with the cicadas humming in the distance. Those were the times the weight of everything would rise in me. The missing years, the secret buried at their birth, the unfairness of having one son stolen without my knowing. One evening, I finally let the question slip. "Do you ever resent me?" I asked quietly, my hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. Luke shook his head, his eyes steady on the yard. "No. You didn't take me away. You found me. That's what matters." His words loosened something in my chest I had carried for 2 decades. Ellis continued to grow stronger, and the bond between the brothers deepened in ways both subtle and profound. I would catch Ellis leaning against Luke's shoulder during a late-night movie, or Luke instinctively reaching to steady him when he wavered on uneven ground. It wasn't grand gestures, but small, natural ones, the kind that proved love without saying it. They were learning each other's rhythms, Ellis's quick wit, Luke's quiet steadiness. It was as if their lives had been waiting for this point of intersection all along. One Saturday, Ellis insisted on cooking breakfast, a tradition his father had once held. Luke stood beside him at the stove, offering help he didn't really need. The two of them shoulder to shoulder, laughing when the eggs came out half-burned. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, because in that moment, the kitchen was filled with something I thought I'd never feel again: completeness. Jonas had been gone for years, but now the house wasn't empty. It carried the sound of family again. The truth of how it had all happened never stopped hurting. I still thought of the delivery room, of the doctor telling me only one child had survived, of the man who had made the choice without my knowing. But when I looked at Ellis and Luke together, I realized anger couldn't undo the past. What mattered was that both my sons had found their way back to each other. And to me, we were not the family I had imagined, but perhaps we were something better, one forged in fire, in loss, in a kind of miracle that had no explanation except endurance. As the weeks turned to months, our lives found a quiet balance. Luke never asked for recognition, never sought to fill a role that wasn't his. He was simply present, steady, dependable, and that was enough. Ellis's health continued to climb, his energy spilling back into the days until he seemed, at times, like the boy he had been before all of this began. And I, after years of carrying grief in silence, finally allowed myself to exhale. The night came when we sat together again on the porch, Ellis inside reading, Luke sipping tea beside me, the fireflies blinking across the yard. I turned to him, my voice low. I used to think I had lost more than I could ever regain, but maybe I was wrong. Luke smiled faintly, his gaze still on the dark horizon. Sometimes what you lose finds its way back, just not in the way you expect. In that moment, with the summer air heavy and kind, I realized he was right. Life doesn't mend cleanly, but it does mend. And as I listened to Ellis's laughter through the screen door, I felt the truth of it settle deep in my bones. We had been scattered, but we were no longer lost. Autumn came softly, with cooler nights and leaves beginning to scatter the yard. Ellis was strong again, his steps no longer hesitant, his voice full of life that had once slipped to a whisper. He walked around the block each morning, waved to neighbors who had prayed for him, and came home asking what was for breakfast, as though the months in the hospital had been only a bad dream. Luke kept showing up, never as a guest, but as someone who belonged. And the house filled with the sound of 2 young men learning what it meant to be brothers. One evening, Ellis pulled out the old family photo albums I had avoided for years. He spread them across the table, pointing at Jonas's faint smile, at his own gap-toothed grin in school pictures. Luke leaned over, studying every detail, laughing at Ellis's childhood stories, listening with the quiet reverence of someone gathering missing pieces of himself. When Ellis finally asked, "Do you wish you'd grown up here with me?" Luke didn't hesitate. "I wish I'd known sooner," he said. "But I think we found each other when we needed to most." The room fell into a hush that wasn't heavy, but whole, as if the past no longer carried the same sharp edges. For me, the greatest shift was inside. For years, I had lived with the weight of absence. Jonas gone too soon. Ellis fighting for his life. The child I thought I had lost before I could even hold him. But now, when I looked at both of them, I saw not only what I had lost, but what had been restored. Not perfectly, not neatly, but truthfully. We were a quilt stitched back together with uneven seams, yet warmer than I could have imagined. One night, as the three of us sat on the porch, Ellis resting with a blanket over his knees, Luke sipping tea, I spoke what had been turning in my chest for weeks. I thought I only had one son, and for 20 years, I lived with that truth. But tonight, sitting here with both of you, I realize I was wrong. I always had two. Neither of them answered right away. Ellis reached for my hand. Luke nodded softly. The silence between us carried more than words could. Life has a way of breaking you down, scattering you so thin you wonder if you'll ever feel whole again. But sometimes, in the very places you expect only endings, you stumble into beginnings you didn't know were waiting. Ellis survived not just because of medicine, but because family revealed itself when we needed it most. Luke found the name and history he had been searching for all his life, and I, who had walked so long in grief, discovered that even shattered stories can be pieced back together into something luminous. If you take anything from our story, let it be this: love is not limited by the years we lose or the secrets kept from us. It endures. It waits. And when it returns, it can remake everything. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more stories of resilience, love, and unexpected grace to light.